Hey, what's up? It's me again. In this video, I'll take you through the journey of taking one of my latest VR sculpts and turning it into a physical collectible. I'll walk you through the steps, the tools, and all the other stuff along the way. And if you want to try it yourself, I've included links to the materials and all the stuff I'll be using in the video description. So let's get started. First step is to get the printer ready. I'm using Anycubic water washable ABS-like V2 resin. And before anything else, I make sure that the resin is mixed very well, whatever I had in my bottle and whatever was left in the tank from a previous print. I like using water washable resin because it's easier to clean and you get good details and it's a little less harsh than the super toxic stuff. I don't have a lot of room or ventilation in my apartment to do printing, so whatever can help. I've been using a Elegoo Saturn 4 Ultra printer with the cool tilting vat system, and it's been working fantastic so far. Once the print is ready, and that usually takes around 6 hours or so, I pop it off the plate and start cleaning it up. I carefully tear out the supports. If I want to be more gentle or have a more delicate sculpt, I'll use clippers to cut out the supports. But since this sculpt was pretty big, I'm okay with just removing them with my hands. Yes, it will leave some damage on the sculpt itself, but I'm not too worried about that. I don't do any sanding or anything. I kind of enjoy the rough look of the print. Just like in my VR sculpts, I enjoy the artifact that it creates, and I think it gives it character. I thoroughly wash each part in a solution of alcohol and water twice. The first time in a super dirty container and the second time in a much cleaner one, just so I don't dirty up the big vat of cleaning solution I have. The big container goes onto a cleaning station, which has a little propeller at the bottom and circulates the cleaning solution around. I leave it running for a couple of minutes while I clean up my station. And once the parts are out of the bath, I leave them to air dry for a good while before curing them with UV light, just so I don't get big streaks of cured resin on the surface of my prints. I'm using an older wash and cure station from Anycubic. I wish it was bigger, but it still works fine. I got all my parts done printing, and now we're ready for priming. I attach a little Gator clip to every part, so I don't have to touch them while I paint. And for priming, I'm using this Japanese Mr. Hobby Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. I love this stuff. It goes on very thin and it dries super fast. It's a bit expensive, but the quality is fantastic. I wish I had a bit more space and ventilation to set up a airbrush station, but in the meantime, that stuff works great. I go outside on my tiny balcony to do the priming, which gets a bit trickier during the winter, but for now, it's beautiful outside. And whenever I prime, I try to use very thin coats. I don't want any paint pooling up in recesses and making stuff super gunky. I'll usually do 2 or 3 thin coats of primer. And since our resin is black and our primer is black, the coverage looks very uniform. Priming does 2 things. It gives the paint something to grip onto, and it evens out the surface so that it looks less janky. The raw print can often look shiny and patchy. The primer makes everything uniform and makes painting a lot easier. You can also use stuff like Citadel Chaos Black Primer, but I much prefer the Japanese stuff. Once everything is primed, I'm back at my desk and I remove the clips from all the parts. But before I start painting, I want to assemble the whole thing and take a couple of photos, just so I'm able to release the 3D printing files faster on the Patreon. If I wait after the whole painting process is done before posting, it can add days or weeks to the whole release date. I'm always impatient when it comes to getting these print files into people's hands as quickly as possible. So huge thanks if you've been supporting the Patreon. And if you want to grab any of my models to print, just head on over there. We got a bunch of stuff. I try to release a new model every month, and we make sure everything is pre-supported and high quality and tested before it gets to you guys. So here is our assembled model. It already looks pretty sick, just all black. I'd be happy displaying it as is, but I want to try a new painting technique I saw. It's gonna be a mix between grimdark, Warhammer 40k painting, and Gundam painting. I'm not an expert on mini painting by any means. I just wanted to share the way I approach this project. Every time I paint, I'm trying to learn something new. The last big project I did was using a lot of Speedpaint and the slap chop method, but this time I'm gonna try some grimdark stuff with a sponge. I always strive to find the best method that gives you the best result for the least amount of work. It might not be the proper way to do it, but hey, don't listen to any of the nerds online that will tell you that it's not the right way to do it. What matters is that it works for you. So we're going to be using this Vallejo Model Air set for base sculpt, as well as a bunch of other speed paint from Army Painter, and some other bunch of random stuff for weathering and panel lining, but we'll go over that once we get there. I try to stay organized with these little boxes as much as possible, but stuff quickly gets out of control and gets super messy, so we'll just embrace the mess. I have my trusty brush holder guy over here. Maybe you saw the sculpt for this one in a previous video, and if you want to make one for yourself, the files are on the Patreon. But we'll just grab ourselves a couple of brushes and set up the little cardboard palette I have here with some water, and just have a surface I can work on without dirtying my whole desk mat. We're going to be using these cheap makeup sponges I got at TNT in the makeup section. In all the videos I saw about sponge painting, they were using the round ones, but they didn't have any, so we're going to make do with what we have. Before I jump on an actual piece, I like to test out the paint on a random bit of an old print I had laying around. That way I can see how the paint reacts and what kind of marks I can make with the sponge. Every time I try a new color, I'll test it out on that random bit. Once I'm happy with the color, I just add a few drops of the paint directly out of the bottle on a little piece of cardboard. I dab my sponge in the paint and I tippy-tap on my model, trying to build out the color slowly. If there's some random bits of support still attached to the piece, I'll rip them out using tweezers. Using a sponge that way, it allows me to put paint only on the surface of stuff and keep the crevices nice and dark. To get a more layered look, I decided to apply some dark brown directly in the crevices. Using an old shitty brush, I work in a way that's pretty messy, and that's fine because it'll emphasize a pretty weathered and dirty look. I just make sure that the paint is not too thick or hides any of the detail. You can see here that when I apply my green on top of it, the brown will only show up in the deep recesses of the model. It was fun working that way because I didn't need to be super precise. The brown acts kind of like a underpainting. It adds some texture and I can build on top of it. I'll add some cleaner details later on whenever I have a rough base coat over everything. So you start very messy, but as you go you get cleaner and cleaner. The dark brown blends nicely with the black primer that we had. After that I keep building up green paint with my sponge. I'll be using two types of green, but the darker one, I just want to cover everything up. This works kind of like dry brushing, but I get a very even coverage with the sponge, and the texture I get with the sponge is pretty nice too. The recesses stay nice and dark with a lot of brown texture in it. Working that way is also super fast, you don't have to be precise or anything. And the sponge is really nice too because it doesn't leave any directional brush marks. I really enjoyed working this way. It gave me a really nice outcome with very minimal effort. It's super satisfying to just tap your models and see all the details appear because you're only hitting the raised edge of stuff. We got all of our parts base coated. It looks pretty nice. And then we're gonna move on to highlighting some of that detail. I reassembled the whole sculpt, and using a lighter shade of green, I'm just tapping on points where the light would hit. And since the whole model is assembled, I don't bother with areas that are hidden or occluded. I just focus on parts that actually catch the light. I'm also just indicating where I want my highlights to be. I found it easier to work that way because if I were to do it on each part separately, I would have to keep track of what is exposed and what's hidden. I'm basically blocking out the highlight placement. Once I have everything marked down, I can disassemble the whole mech and then work on refining the highlights, but on each part separately. I'm adding more highlights very sparingly using gentle pressure on my sponge, and I try not to cover too much the dark green I had below it. You can see what it looks like now with our brown underpainting, our green base coat, and our light green highlights. I'm going to be swapping my setup a little bit, moving away from the sponge, and we're going to do some detailing with a brush. We're getting into the smaller details and our sponge is too big, so working with a brush will allow us to get more precise and control a bit more where the paint is going to be. I'm swapping to these Speedpaint V2 from Army Painter. I chose colors that are pretty similar to the ones we have already on our model. These paints are made for Mini or Warhammer painting and they go on super transparent. I'm gonna be using them basically like a multiply layer and help me get separation between the different parts. Since they're transparent, you can still see the highlight below them. These kinds of paint are not really good for big surfaces though. They work best on areas with a lot of details because they pull up in recesses and leave the highlights exposed. Since we're going for a pretty weathered look, I'm not too bothered about streaks or uneven surfaces. But if I was trying to go for a factory fresh look, I don't think I would be using those paints. They're great for mini painting, but since our project is a little bit bigger, they're a bit tricky to use. After using these speed paints on a couple of different projects, I got a better feel for what works and what doesn't, and honestly I'm pretty happy with how everything turned out on this one. For the next step, I wanted to get a more opaque coverage so I can cover up the base coat that we put in. So I decided to blend some of the speed paint that's very transparent and liquid with some of the more opaque but thicker Vallejo model paint. I tried to make a pretty neutral gray color that resembles raw metal. I used this gray to go over all of the swords on the mech. That way the blades feel like a different material from the rest of the armor. And I used that color to break up more of the shapes and to give the illusion that the mech is composed of all these different kind of parts. Moving on to some more highlighting, I used a light gray from Vallejo. I like that this stuff is pretty thin, but still very opaque. I load up my brush and I remove some of the excess paint. And then I hit only the edge of the sword, trying to be as precise as I can here. As the project moves along, I slow down and I take a lot more control. At the start it's very fast and loose with the sponge, but once we get into detailing and hedge highlights, the pace shifts and it gets slower, more deliberate, more precise. I try to anchor my hands or my piece on something like the edge of the table or the edge of my palette. That way I'm not shaky and I have very steady and controlled brushwork. I decided to edge highlight only the swords. I could have done it for the whole model, but it would have taken me a very long time. And again, I'm all for maximum results and minimum effort. I saw a bunch of tutorials for sword painting, but they all required a ton of blending and multiple coats and all that stuff. So I decided to only go for highlight, and having a crisp, sharp highlight makes the part look really shiny. I'm using some more of this light gray to punch out different pieces, using it pretty sparingly just to accent certain parts. The light gray accents break up the surface and make certain details pop, but it doesn't overpower the rest of the paint job. It's a way to add contrast and kind of guide the eye, but still keeping an overall look pretty balanced and grounded. I also used a dark gray in the same manner, and I used a dark gray speed paint to punch out some of the details in those bolts. Next, I'm going to be using some Tamiya panel line accent color. It's basically a super thin enamel wash. It comes in a bunch of different colors, but I'm going to be using the brown. And this is where things go back to being messy again. You drop that stuff into panel lines and cracks and recessed details, and it kind of flows on its own. It's a really easy way to bring out depth and make small details stand out. I'm not really using it for panel lining here, I'm more using it kind of like rust. It pulls up in all the cracks, and since they're all dark from our base coat and our brown underpainting, it shows up really well and it adds a lot of super nice details, but requiring very minimal effort. It also dries pretty matte, so it adds another level of contrast to our paint job. And if for some reason you mess up and use too much, it's super easy to clean up. I just use a Zippo lighter fluid. I drop some on a Q-tip and then I just very gently sponge away some of the wash. That stuff works like magic. And it's also a very controlled way of doing washes. It's kind of like grimdark diet. And it's pretty hard to mess up. Since the tip of the brush is so small, it's very hard to put too much. And honestly, this is my favorite part about the whole painting process. It's just finishing touches on the whole model, and I find it very relaxing and satisfying just to see that wash pull up and flow into the cracks and make all your detail just stand out. I think in my next project I'll play even more with washes and maybe use oil paints and white spirit to do this whole grimdark reductive technique. I really enjoy playing with different types of paints, different types of medium, and trying something new on each model I paint. While I was putting everything back together, the model fell over and the head broke. I tried to glue back the antenna, but there was a big crack and the top fin was just lost somewhere on my floor. So I decided to just reprint the part and do the whole process of painting the whole thing all over again. Because why not do a recap of the whole process? So priming, putting some dark brown in the recesses, some little sponging with the dark green and the light green for the base coat, and a little bit of highlights. And then using some light gray to paint some accent colors and some little detailing. This top fin was a pretty important part of the design because it's like a main accent part, and that's the main reason why I decided to reprint the whole head. And after that, some enamel wash with the Tamiya stuff, and we're all done. Almost. Now it's time to glue everything together so that it holds. I'm just using Gorilla Glue. I decided also not to paint the base and just to keep it that black primer color. That way the design can really shine and the base doesn't distract from the mech. But really that's cope and I just didn't want to do it. There's a bunch more stuff I could have done to the paint job, like doing some markings and some decals and stuff. I could have pushed the highlighting further. I could have layered the different colors more. I could have put more washes and weathering. But at some point you just run out of steam, and that's fine. You just carry those lessons onto the next project. And nothing's ever going to be perfect. You just try to make the next one better. And at the end of the day, this whole thing is about having fun and making something cool. It doesn't need to be perfect. You just need to feel good to make. And with this piece, I feel like I got there. I learned a few things, I made a few mistakes, but I ended up with something I'm proud of. And that's the whole point. Keep creating, keep learning, and enjoy the process along the way. Putting everything back together and looking at our finished project felt really nice to see all that we accomplished. Really happy with how this paint job came out. A lot of what I'm doing here comes from different places, techniques from Gunpla or from 40K mini painting, and I just mash all of them together in a way that works for me. Maybe it'll work for you, maybe not, and that's fine. We all do things our own way. The important part is trying new stuff, experimenting, and finding your own approach. Have fun with your model making and have fun with your sculpting. Don't get too paralyzed or anxious about the result. None of it has to be perfect. It's about enjoying the process and watching the piece come to life. So I hope you guys enjoyed the journey and seeing how the sausage is made in more details. At first, when somebody asked for a painting tutorial, I was kind of iffy about it because in my head, I'm no expert and there's so many more good painting YouTube channels out there. And I was thinking, why would people want to see my stuff? Just go watch some guy that won the Golden Demon. His mini painting techniques are just so much better. No clue, but you're still here, so I guess something's working. If you can pick up a trick or get inspired to try your own thing, then it's worth it. And if nothing else, hopefully it's just fun to watch. So thanks for sticking around. Please let me know in the comments if there's something that you would like to see. Let me know if you enjoyed the whole narrated process. I was really debating on just putting out the time-lapse with no voiceover and just the music. But at the end of the day, I think it was worth it because it's pretty technical. I'll put a link in the description to all of the supplies and tools I used. Next video, we'll go back to some VR sculpting. I got some cool projects in mind that I've been working on. So I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!